On a scorching August morning in 1979, a jogger running along the Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu made a discovery that would haunt Southern California for the next year. There, dumped beside the road like discarded trash, was the naked body of a 17-year-old boy. His name was Marcus Grabs, a German exchange student who had been backpacking across America, living the dream that so many young people chase. But Marcus's American adventure had become a nightmare. He had been stabbed 77 times, sodomized, and beaten with a tire iron. An orange nylon cord was wrapped loosely around his head. An ignition wire bound his ankles. What the jogger didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that Marcus was just the beginning. Over the next 11 months, the bodies of teenage boys would appear with horrifying regularity along Southern California's sprawling freeway system. They would be found naked or half-clothed, dumped like garbage beside on-ramps and off-ramps, in parking lots, and behind dumpsters. All had been tortured, raped, and murdered with a savagery that defied comprehension. The killer was methodical, invisible, and seemingly unstoppable. He drove the freeways in a beat-up van, hunting for victims with the patience of a predator and the cunning of a ghost. But what made him truly terrifying wasn't just his brutality, it was that he didn't work alone. He had accomplices, young men barely out of their teens, who helped him lure, torture, and kill with an enthusiasm that shocked even seasoned detectives. His name was William George Bonin, and by the time his reign of terror ended, he would be known as the Freeway Killer, one of the most prolific and sadistic serial killers in American history. But the story of how he became a monster begins long before he ever set foot on a California freeway. William Bonin was born on January 8, 1947, in Willimantic, Connecticut, into a family where violence was as common as breathing. His parents, Robert and Alice Bonin, were both alcoholics who turned their home into a battlefield. Robert was a World War II veteran whose war never really ended. He brought the brutality home with him, beating his wife and children with the same methodical efficiency he had once used against enemy soldiers. By the time William was 6 years old, his parents had given up any pretense of caring for their children. William and his two brothers were shipped off to the Franco-American Orphanage, a Catholic institution that promised salvation but delivered only more suffering. It was here, in rooms draped with crucifixes and filled with the echoes of prayer, that William learned his first lessons about power, control, and pain. The orphanage was supposed to be a refuge, but for William it became a hunting ground for predators in religious clothing. At 8 years old, he was sexually assaulted by older boys and possibly staff members. The abuse was systematic, brutal, and covered up by the very people who were supposed to protect him. Medical records would later reveal extensive scarring on William's head and buttocks, injuries so severe that he claimed to have no memory of receiving them, a psychological defense mechanism that allowed him to survive but left him fundamentally broken. But perhaps the most chilling detail of William's abuse was how he learned to cope with it. He told doctors years later that he would only submit to sexual assault if his hands were tied behind his back. The restraints, he said, made him feel less afraid, less responsible for what was happening to him. It was a twisted psychology that would later manifest in his own crimes, where bondage and helplessness became sources of sexual arousal. When William was 9, his family moved to California, settling in Downey. But the change of scenery didn't heal the damage that had already been done. By this time, William had already begun molesting his younger brother, passing on the cycle of abuse like a virus. He was withdrawn, angry, and increasingly violent. His mother, Alice, considered him worthless as a human being, a assessment that William carried with him like a brand. As a teenager, William's behavior became increasingly erratic. He committed petty crimes, stole cars, and got into fights. But it was his sexual crimes that marked him as truly dangerous. In 1968, at the age of 21, he was arrested for kidnapping and sexually assaulting 5 boys. The psychiatric evaluation that followed painted a terrifying portrait of a young man who was completely without empathy or remorse. The doctors at Atascadero State Hospital diagnosed William with an IQ of 121. He was intelligent, articulate, and completely devoid of human compassion. They found evidence of manic depression, sexual sadism disorder, and antisocial personality disorder. Most chilling of all, they discovered that William's sexuality had been completely warped by trauma. He could only achieve arousal through violence and domination. Sex, for William, was inseparable from suffering. He was released in 1974 after doctors declared him no longer a danger to others, a decision that would prove to be catastrophically wrong. But William had learned something important during his time in the hospital. He needed to be smarter about his crimes. When he was arrested again in 1975 for raping 2 more teenage boys, he realized that leaving victims alive was a liability. When he was released from prison in October 1978, William made a vow that would define the next phase of his life. He would never get caught again. And if that meant killing his victims to silence them forever, so be it. Back in Downey, William took a job as a truck driver and rented a modest apartment. To his neighbors, he seemed like an ordinary guy trying to rebuild his life. He even had a girlfriend and appeared to be making an effort to go straight. But beneath the surface, something darker was brewing. William had discovered the parties thrown by his neighbor, Everett Fraser, where young men gathered to drink, do drugs, and engage in casual sex. It was here that William met the accomplices who would help him transform from a serial rapist into something far worse. The first was Vernon Butts, a 21-year-old drifter with a history of mental illness and suicide attempts. Butts was everything William wasn't: weak, easily manipulated, and desperate for acceptance. He had been fired from his job at a magic shop for his increasingly erratic behavior and had a reputation as an oddball who lived on the fringes of society. But William saw potential in Vernon's weakness. Here was someone who could be molded, controlled, and turned into a willing participant in acts of unthinkable cruelty. The second accomplice was Gregory Miley, an 18-year-old casual laborer from Texas who had drifted to California looking for work and adventure. Miley was young, impressionable, and struggling to find his place in the world. William recognized the hunger in the young man's eyes, the same desperate need for belonging that he had felt his entire life. But where William's need had curdled into rage, Miley's could still be directed and shaped. William's method was simple but devastatingly effective. He would cruise the freeways in his Ford van, looking for young men who were hitchhiking or walking alone. His targets were always the same: teenage boys and young men between the ages of 12 and 19, often from broken homes or living on the streets. They were society's throwaways, the kind of people who could disappear without anyone raising too much of a fuss. William's approach was disarmingly casual. He would pull over and offer a ride, sometimes claiming to be looking for someone to do odd jobs, other times simply presenting himself as a friendly older man willing to help out a kid in need. He was articulate, non-threatening, and had a van that looked legitimate, complete with work clothes and tools that made his cover story believable. But once his victims were inside the van, William's mask would slip away. He would drive to isolated locations, parking lots, construction sites, or remote stretches of road where he would reveal his true intentions. Some victims were drugged with alcohol or sedatives. Others were simply overpowered by William and his accomplices. What followed was a ritual of torture and sexual violence that defied human comprehension. William didn't just rape his victims, he savored their suffering. He would beat them with tire irons, force them to drink caustic chemicals like hydrochloric acid, and stab them with ice picks. He later told psychiatrists that he derived intense pleasure from hearing his victims scream, that their terror and pain gave him a sense of power and control that he had never experienced as a helpless child. But perhaps most disturbing of all, William saw his murders as a form of emotional release, a way to purge years of rage and humiliation onto innocent victims who reminded him of his own vulnerability. The killing began in earnest on August 5th, 1979, with the murder of Marcus Grabs. William and Vernon Butts had spotted the young German student hitchhiking near Newport Beach. They offered him a ride, and Marcus, trusting and eager to see more of America, climbed into their van. What happened next set the template for all the murders that would follow. Marcus was driven to a remote location, sexually assaulted, and then killed with a savagery that shocked even veteran investigators. His body was dumped beside the road in Malibu, the first of many that would appear along Southern California's freeways. 3 weeks later, William and Vernon struck again. This time, their victim was Donald Hayden, a 15-year-old boy they picked up near the Gay Community Services Center in Los Angeles. Donald's body was found near Liberty Canyon, strangled and stabbed. Then came David Murillo, a 17-year-old who was bicycling to the movies when William and Vernon abducted him. David was beaten to death with a tire iron, his skull crushed beyond recognition. With each murder, William grew bolder and more confident. He began to see himself as an apex predator, perfectly adapted to hunt in the urban wilderness of Southern California. The freeways gave him anonymity and mobility. He could strike anywhere within a 100-mile radius and disappear into traffic before anyone realized what had happened. And his van was the perfect hunting blind, allowing him to prowl for victims while appearing to be just another working man going about his business. But William's greatest asset wasn't his methods or his mobility. It was his ability to recruit accomplices. Young men like Vernon Butts and Gregory Miley weren't just helping him commit crimes, they were validating his sense of power and importance. For the first time in his life, William was the leader, the one making the decisions and giving the orders. He had found the social belonging that had always eluded him, even if it was built on a foundation of murder and sexual violence. By early 1980, William had brought Gregory Miley into his inner circle. On February 3rd, William and Miley picked up 15-year-old Charles Miranda in West Hollywood. They drove him to a secluded location where both men sexually assaulted him before strangling him with his own t-shirt. William later told investigators that immediately after killing Miranda, he turned to Miley and said, "I need another one." Within minutes, they had spotted 12-year-old James McCabe, who was on his way to Disneyland with his family. The boy was abducted, raped, beaten, and strangled, his small body dumped behind a dumpster like garbage. The speed and casualness of the double murder shocked even experienced detectives. It revealed something chilling about William's psychology. Killing had become as routine and necessary to him as eating or sleeping. He later compared his urges to drug addiction, explaining that he felt an intense restlessness and sexual frustration in the hours before his murders, followed by a sense of relief and euphoria after each killing. But like any addiction, the relief was temporary, and the urges always returned stronger than before. As 1980 progressed, the pace of the murders accelerated. William killed 4 more victims in March, 2 in April, and 1 in May. The bodies piled up along the freeways like mile markers on a road to hell. Each victim was tortured with increasing sadism. Some were forced to drink industrial chemicals, others were stabbed with ice picks or beaten beyond recognition. Several were emasculated, and many were strangled with their own clothing. The level of violence was so extreme that even hardened crime scene investigators struggled to process what they were seeing. But William's luck was running out. In May 1980, one of his accomplices, William Pugh, was arrested for auto theft. While in custody, Pugh heard details about the freeway killer case on a radio broadcast and realized that the perpetrator's methods matched exactly what William Bonin had described to him months earlier. Faced with the possibility of serious jail time, Pugh decided to cooperate with police. He told investigators that he suspected Bonin might be the freeway killer, though he carefully omitted his own role in one of the murders. The tip led police to place William under surveillance just as he was preparing for what would become his final murder. On June 2nd, 1980, William and his newest accomplice, James Monroe, picked up 18-year-old Stephen Wells from a bus stop in Downey. Wells was promised money for sex and agreed to go back to William's apartment. Instead, he was beaten, raped, and strangled to death with his own shirt. His body was stuffed into a cardboard box and driven to Vernon Butts' house for disposal. But the surveillance team was watching. On June 11th, they observed William approaching a 15-year-old boy at a park and attempting to lure him into his van. When the boy resisted, the police moved in and arrested William in the act of attempted kidnapping. The freeway killer's reign of terror was finally over. In custody, William's facade of normality crumbled completely. When confronted with evidence of his crimes, he confessed with a calmness that chilled investigators. He admitted to killing 21 boys and young men, providing details that only the killer could have known. He showed no remorse for his actions and even seemed to take pride in his accomplishments. When one reporter asked him what he would be doing if he were still free, William replied with chilling honesty, "I'd still be killing." I couldn't stop killing. It got easier each time. The trial that followed was a media sensation, but also a glimpse into the mind of a killer whose cruelty defied explanation. Prosecutors called William the most arch-evil person who ever existed, and the evidence supported that assessment. Victim after victim was revealed to have suffered unimaginable torment before death finally released them from William's sadistic games. Vernon Butts never lived to see trial. On January 11th, 1981, he hanged himself in his jail cell with a towel, leaving behind a note that called the killing spree a good little nightmare. Gregory Miley was sentenced to 25 years to life and would later die in prison after being attacked by fellow inmates. James Monroe received 15 years to life and has been repeatedly denied parole. William Pugh, the youngest accomplice, was sentenced to 6 years for voluntary manslaughter. William himself was sentenced to death and spent 14 years on death row at San Quentin State Prison. During that time, he maintained his innocence in letters to supporters and even tried to blame Vernon Butts for being the real ringleader of the murders. But investigators who had worked the case knew better, as prosecutor Sterling Norris observed shortly before William's execution. He was the leader, and he chose weak people he could use. On February 23, 1996, William George Bonin became the first person executed by lethal injection in California. His final meal consisted of 2 large pepperoni and sausage pizzas, 3 pints of coffee ice cream, and Coca-Cola. In his final statement, he showed no remorse for his crimes, but offered this piece of advice. I would suggest that when a person has thought of doing anything serious against the law, that before they did, that they should go to a quiet place and think about it seriously. It was a typically self-serving statement from a man who had never shown genuine concern for anyone but himself. William had spent his entire adult life taking what he wanted from others, their innocence, their dignity, their lives, without ever considering the consequences of his actions. Even facing death, he remained the same narcissistic predator he had always been. The legacy of the freeway killer extends far beyond the 21 confirmed victims. Investigators believe William may have been responsible for as many as 44 murders, many of which will never be officially solved. There were the missing persons reports that were never connected, the bodies that were never found, the families who never learned what happened to their sons and brothers. William took those secrets with him to the grave. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of William's story is how he was able to operate for so long without being caught. Part of it was his mobility. The freeway system gave him access to millions of potential victims across Southern California. Part of it was his choice of victims, young men who were often estranged from their families or living on the streets, people whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or investigated with the same urgency as missing children from stable homes. Most of all, though, William succeeded because he understood how to exploit the fundamental human need for connection and belonging. His victims got into his van because they trusted him, because he offered them something they desperately needed: a ride, a job, money, or simply human companionship. He preyed on the very qualities that make us human: our willingness to help others, our desire for acceptance, our basic assumption that most people mean us no harm. The accomplices who helped William commit his crimes were victims of this same exploitation. Vernon Butts, Gregory Miley, James Monroe, and William Pugh were all young men struggling to find their place in the world. William gave them a sense of purpose and belonging, even if that purpose was monstrous. He made them feel important, powerful, and part of something bigger than themselves. It was only after they were caught that they realized they had been manipulated by a master predator who saw them as disposable tools rather than human beings. William Bonin represents the terrifying intersection of trauma and evil. His childhood abuse doesn't excuse his crimes, but it helps explain how a human being can become so completely disconnected from empathy and compassion. The scared little boy who was tied up and assaulted in a Catholic orphanage grew up to become a man who tied up and assaulted others. The cycle of abuse that began with his parents' alcoholism and violence continued with religious predators and culminated in William becoming a predator himself. But thousands of people suffer childhood abuse without becoming serial killers. What made William different was his complete inability to break the cycle, to choose compassion over cruelty, healing over hatred. Instead, he embraced his darkness and used his intelligence and charisma to spread that darkness to others. He became not just a killer, but a corrupter, turning vulnerable young men into accomplices in acts of unthinkable evil. Today, William Bonin is largely forgotten outside of true crime circles. He doesn't have the name recognition of Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy, and his crimes don't inspire documentaries or horror movies. Perhaps that's because his story is too disturbing, too nihilistic for popular entertainment. There's no redemption arc, no moment of insight or remorse. There's only the methodical destruction of human life by a man who found pleasure in causing pain. The freeways where William hunted are still there, carrying millions of commuters every day. The off-ramps where he dumped his victims have been repaved and rebuilt, but the memories remain. For the families of his victims, the pain never really ends. They are left with questions that will never be answered, with grief that time cannot heal, with the knowledge that their loved ones died in agony at the hands of a man who felt nothing but satisfaction at their suffering. The Freeway Killer's story is a reminder that evil is not always exotic or mysterious. Sometimes it drives a delivery truck, lives in an apartment complex, and chats with neighbors about the weather. Sometimes it looks like an ordinary man offering a ride to a teenager walking home from work. And sometimes it recruits accomplices by offering them the one thing they've always wanted, the feeling that they finally belong somewhere, even if that somewhere is a van full of torture instruments and the screams of the innocent. William George Bonin died as he lived, without remorse, without redemption, and without any understanding of the immeasurable pain he had caused. His last words were not an apology to his victims' families or an acknowledgement of his crimes, but a self-serving lecture about thinking before committing crimes. Even in death, he remained exactly what he had always been, a predator who saw other human beings as nothing more than objects to be used and discarded. The boys and young men who died on California's freeways between 1979 and 1980 deserve to be remembered not as statistics or victims, but as individuals who had dreams, hopes, and people who loved them. They were sons and brothers, students and workers, each with their own story that was cut short by a man who believed his desires were more important than their lives. Their names, Marcus Grabbs, Donald Hayden, David Murillo, Charles Miranda, James McCabe, and so many others, should be spoken with the respect and dignity that William Bonin never showed them in life. The freeway killer is gone, but the freeways remain, carrying new generations of young people toward uncertain futures. And somewhere out there, perhaps, another predator is watching, learning, waiting for the right moment to strike. Because the one thing that William Bonin's story teaches us, above all else, is that monsters are real, they live among us, and they never stop hunting. In the sprawling concrete maze of Chicago, where neon lights barely penetrated the darkness between towering buildings, where the wind carried more than just the scent of Lake Michigan, something was hunting. The year was 1981, and women were disappearing. Not the way people usually vanish in a big city, lost in crowds or swallowed by circumstance, but violently, methodically, ritualistically. What no one knew, what no one could have imagined, was that 4 men had turned murder into worship, torture into communion, and human flesh into sacrament. They called themselves many things, but the world would come to know them by a single, chilling name: the Chicago Rippers. And what they did in the shadows of America's third largest city would make seasoned detectives vomit, hardened prosecutors weep, and an entire metropolis lock their doors at night. Robin Gext was born in 1953, but to understand the monster he became, you have to understand where evil learns its craft. Gecht wasn't some basement-dwelling outcast or street-corner predator. He was an electrician, a carpenter, a man who fixed the wiring in your home and built the structures that kept society running. But more importantly, more chillingly, Robin Gecht once worked for another monster. His boss was John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown himself. Gacy, who buried 33 bodies beneath his house, who dressed as Pogo the Clown while planning murders, who proved that evil could hide behind any mask. When Gacy was finally caught and sentenced, something inside Gecht awakened. Maybe it was inspiration, maybe it was competition, or maybe it was just time for a new kind of evil to emerge from Chicago's underbelly. Gecht had learned from the best, and now he was ready to become something worse. But unlike Gacy, Gecht wouldn't work alone. He began gathering followers, young men adrift in the city's harsh landscape, men who craved belonging and purpose. Enter Edward Spreitzer, 19 years old, staying with the Gecht family, looking for direction in a world that had given him none. Then came the Cocorales brothers, Andrew, 21, and Thomas, 24, both working as laborers for Gecht's contracting business. Lawyers would later describe them as having borderline intellect, as being simplistic and dependent on authority. In other words, they were perfect followers for a man who believed he was destined to lead. What bound them together wasn't friendship or loyalty or even shared trauma. What united them was something far darker, something that most people only encounter in nightmares or horror films. Robin Gecht was obsessed with Satanism, specifically with a twisted interpretation of Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible. But this wasn't philosophical rebellion or teenage angst. This was genuine belief in darkness, in ritual, in the power that could be gained through inflicting the ultimate suffering. Gecht convinced his followers that he possessed supernatural powers, that through their obedience to him and their participation in sacred rituals, They too could transcend ordinary human limitations. And what were these rituals? They were acts of such depravity that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend them. In his attic, Gecht constructed what he called a satanic chapel. The room was draped in darkness, lit only by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on walls painted with 6 red and black crosses. At the center stood an altar covered in red cloth, and it was here that Robin Gecht would read passages from the Satanic Bible while unspeakable acts were committed. This wasn't some teenager's rebellion against Sunday school. This was a fully realized temple to human cruelty. The hunting began in earnest in May 1981. The crew would cruise Chicago's streets in Gecht's red Dodge van, prowling like sharks in the urban ocean. Their targets were women, any women, all women. Contrary to what many believed, they didn't just hunt prostitutes or the marginalized. They took whoever they could get, working professionals, mothers, young women just starting their lives. Linda Sutton was 28 years old, a single mother trying to build a life for herself and her 2 children in Chicago. On May 23, 1981, she was abducted near Wrigley Field in broad daylight. For 10 days, her family searched, her children waited, the police investigated. Then her body was found in a field behind the Rip Van Winkle Motel in Villa Park, and what they discovered changed everything. Linda hadn't just been murdered, she'd been mutilated in ways that defied comprehension. Her left breast had been severed with surgical precision using a wire garrote. But that was just the beginning, because what the Ripper crew did with their victims' bodies was worse than the killing itself. According to confessions later given by crew members, the severed breasts weren't discarded. They were kept, they were used. In Gecht's satanic chapel, with candles flickering and crosses leering down from the walls, Robin Gecht would masturbate into the severed flesh while reading passages from his perverted Bible. Then, in a ritual that perverted every sacred act of communion, he would cut the breast into pieces and distribute them to his followers, who would consume the flesh as if it were a holy sacrament. This wasn't just murder. This was cannibalism wrapped in the language of religion, torture disguised as worship, and they were just getting started. For nearly a year, the killings stopped. Police had no leads, no patterns to follow, no understanding that Linda Sutton's death was anything more than an isolated act of extreme violence. But in Gecht's chapel, the hunger was growing. His followers were becoming more devoted, more willing to follow wherever their leader might take them. And in May 1982, they struck again. Lorraine Borowski was 21 years old, bright and optimistic, working as a secretary at a real estate office in the Chicago suburbs. On the morning of May 15th, 1982, she stepped outside her apartment to walk to work, just as she had dozens of times before. She never made it. The Ripper crew was waiting. Lorraine was abducted in broad daylight, in a public area, by men who had perfected the art of making people disappear. Her body wouldn't be found for 5 months, buried in a cemetery in Clarendon Hills, subjected to the same ritualistic mutilation that had claimed Linda Sutton. But the crew was growing bolder, more frequent in their attacks. 2 weeks after taking Lorraine, they abducted Shui Mak, a 30-year-old Chinese immigrant who had gotten into an argument with her brother and was abandoned on the side of a road. The crew mocked her with racial slurs as they dragged her to her death, proving that their hatred extended beyond gender to encompass anyone they deemed unworthy of life. Then came Angel York, 19 years old, who somehow survived her encounter with the Ripper crew. They handcuffed her, slashed her breast, performed their perverted rituals, then inexplicably let her go. Maybe they thought she wouldn't survive. Maybe they wanted someone to spread fear. Maybe they were just drunk on their own power and felt invincible. Angel gave police a description of her attackers and their van, but in a city the size of Chicago, it wasn't enough. The investigation stalled and the killing continued. Sandra Delaware, 18 years old, was found strangled with her own bra on the banks of the Chicago River. Rose Beck Davis, 30 years old, a marketing executive, was found beaten with an axe and stabbed in an alley in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood. Carol Pappas disappeared entirely, her body never found, though her death bore all the hallmarks of the Ripper crew's work. But it was Beverly Washington who would finally give police the break they needed. On October 6th, 1982, the 18-year-old was found barely alive near railroad tracks in Humboldt Park. Her left breast had been amputated, her right breast savagely slashed, her body bearing the signature wounds that marked her as another victim of the crew. But Beverly Washington was tough, she was a fighter, and most importantly, she was a survivor. Despite her trauma, despite the horror she had endured, Beverly was able to give police a detailed description of her attackers and their vehicle. She described a red Dodge van with blue and white feathers hanging from the rearview mirror and a wooden partition separating the front from the back. She described men who spoke in satanic language while they tortured her, who seemed to believe they were performing some kind of sacred ritual. 2 weeks later, police spotted a van matching Beverly's description. The driver was Edward Spreitzer, 21 years old, who immediately led police to his boss, Robin Gecht, the owner of the van and the suspected ringleader of the crew. When police first encountered Gecht, they were struck by how normal he seemed. He was calm, polite, almost cheerful. He had a wife and 3 children, a legitimate business, neighbors who considered him helpful and reliable. This wasn't the slavering monster they had expected to find. This was something far more terrifying, evil that could wear a human face and blend seamlessly into society. Initially, police didn't have enough evidence to hold Gecht, and he was released on bond. But investigators kept digging, and what they found was a trail of horror that led directly to the Rip Van Winkle motel, where Gecht and 3 companions had rented adjoining rooms months earlier. The motel manager remembered them as party animals who frequently brought women to their rooms, but he also remembered something else. The men had appeared to be involved in some kind of cult. The other tenants were the Cocorales brothers, and when police tracked them down, the younger brother, Thomas, cracked under questioning. What poured out of him was a confession so detailed, so horrifying, that veteran detectives had trouble processing what they were hearing. Thomas described the satanic chapel in Robin Gecht's attic. He described how they would take women there and torture them while Gecht read from the Satanic Bible. He described the amputation of breasts using wire garrotes, the ritualistic consumption of human flesh, the complete dehumanization of their victims. He described a world where murder had become worship and cruelty had become communion. When police searched Gecht's home, they found exactly what Thomas had described. The satanic chapel was real, complete with its red-draped altar and painted crosses. They found the rifle used in a recent shooting. They found evidence linking the crew to multiple murders across the Chicago area. Andrew Kokorales and Edward Spreitzer soon confessed as well, providing details about up to 17 murders committed by the crew. They described their absolute faith in Robin Gecht's supernatural powers, their belief that he could control their minds and make them do whatever he wanted. They portrayed themselves not as willing participants, but as victims of Gecht's mystical influence, men who had been drawn into a web of evil they couldn't escape. But Robin Gecht himself never confessed. Even when faced with overwhelming evidence, even when his own followers turned against him, he maintained his innocence. Without a confession, and with much of the evidence being testimony from his accomplices, prosecutors found it difficult to prove Gecht's involvement in the actual murders. Instead, Gecht was convicted only of the rape and attempted murder of Beverly Washington, the one victim who survived to testify against him. He was sentenced to 120 years in prison, with a possibility of parole in 2042, when he would be 89 years old. The other crew members faced harsher sentences. Edward Spreitzer was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death, though his sentence was later commuted to life in prison without parole when Illinois abolished the death penalty. Andrew Kokorales was executed by lethal injection in 1999, becoming the last person put to death in Illinois before the state imposed a moratorium on executions. Thomas Kokorales, the brother who had confessed and cooperated with police, was initially sentenced to life in prison but later accepted a plea deal for a 70-year sentence. In a move that outraged victims' families and shocked the community, he was released on parole in March 2019 after serving 35 years. The Chicago Rippers case exposed something that most people preferred not to acknowledge: that the satanic panic of the 1980s, while largely overblown, wasn't entirely fabricated. There really were people out there committing horrific crimes in the name of dark rituals. There really were men who believed that torturing and consuming human flesh would grant them supernatural power. But perhaps most disturbing of all, the case proved how easily evil could hide in plain sight. Robin Gecht wasn't a wild-eyed fanatic living in the shadows. He was a businessman, a neighbor, a man who fixed your wiring and built your cabinets. His followers weren't obvious misfits, but young men looking for purpose and belonging, men who found both in the worst possible way. The victims of the Chicago Rippers, Linda Sutton, Lorraine Borowski, Shui Mock, Sandra Delaware, Rosebeck Davis, and the others whose names we may never know, were ordinary women living ordinary lives until they encountered something extraordinary in its evil. They were mothers and daughters, workers and dreamers, people with futures that were cut short by men who believed that their deaths were sacred acts. Today, Robin Gecht sits in his prison cell, now in his 70s, still maintaining his innocence, still eligible for parole in less than 20 years. Edward Spreitzer remains locked away for life, the weight of multiple murders ensuring he'll never see freedom again. Thomas Kokorales walks free, a fact that continues to horrify those who remember what he confessed to doing in that candlelit attic. The red van is long gone, crushed, and melted down decades ago. The Satanic Chapel was dismantled and painted over. The Rip Van Winkle Motel where it all began has been torn down and replaced. But the memory remains, a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters, that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic fanfare. Sometimes it drives a work van through city streets, looking for the next victim to drag into darkness. Sometimes it wears a business suit and shakes your hand with a smile. Sometimes it builds altars in suburban attics and calls murder a sacrament. The Chicago Rippers prove that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones who never let you see them coming. In the fading twilight of an Oregon winter evening in 1981, two young women walked into an office building in Kaiser, Oregon, ready to start their night shift cleaning duties. 20-year-old Sherry Hull and her co-worker Beth Wilmot had no idea they were about to encounter pure evil. What happened next would shatter two lives, devastate countless families, and expose one of the most chilling truths about predators. Sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who once wore heroes' jerseys, because the man waiting in those shadows wasn't some basement-dwelling outcast or career criminal. He was Randall Woodfield, a former NFL draft pick who had once run patterns for the Green Bay Packers. He was handsome, athletic, charming enough to be considered for Playgirl magazine. He was the kind of man parents trusted to babysit their children, and for 5 horrific months, he turned Interstate 5 into his personal hunting ground, leaving a trail of death and devastation that would earn him a place among America's most prolific serial killers. But to understand how a promising athlete became the I-5 killer, you have to go back to the beginning, to a story that proves that evil doesn't always announce itself with warning signs. Sometimes it wears a football uniform and a $1 million smile. Randall Brent Woodfield was born on December 26, 1950, in Salem, Oregon, to what everyone considered the perfect American family. His father was an executive at Pacific Northwest Bell, his mother a dedicated homemaker. The Woodfields were respected, well-known members of their community in picturesque Otter Rock, Oregon, a small seaside town that epitomized Pacific Northwest charm. Randall grew up with 2 older sisters who would go on to become successful professionals, one a doctor, the other an attorney. By every external measure, this was a family destined for success. Young Randy, as he preferred to be called, seemed to embody the all-American dream. He was popular in school, excelled in athletics, and had the kind of natural charisma that drew people to him. At Newport High School, he was a star, running track, playing basketball, and dominating on the football field. Teachers liked him, coaches praised him, and classmates looked up to him. He was the golden boy, the kid who seemed to have it all. But beneath that perfect exterior, something was already wrong. During his teenage years, Randall began exhibiting behavior that should have been a massive red flag. He started exposing himself to unsuspecting victims, becoming what authorities would later call a peeping Tom. He was arrested for indecent exposure while still in high school, but his athletic prowess was so valued that coaches and administrators worked to keep the incident quiet. His juvenile record was expunged when he turned 18, wiping the slate clean and allowing him to move forward as if nothing had happened. This would become a pattern, Randall's crimes being overlooked, minimized, or explained away because of his talent and charm. Society was so invested in the image of the clean cut athlete that it refused to see the predator lurking underneath. After high school, Randall attended Treasure Valley Community College, where he played football for one season before transferring to Portland State University. Even there, his disturbing behavior continued. He was arrested for allegedly ransacking an ex-girlfriend's apartment, though he was found not guilty due to lack of evidence. While at Portland State, he was arrested twice more for indecent exposure, but somehow these incidents didn't derail his football career. Playing as a wide receiver for the Portland State Vikings, Randall was good enough to catch the attention of NFL scouts. Despite his growing rap sheet of sexual offenses, he was drafted by the Green Bay Packers in 1974 as the 428th overall pick in the 17th round. Back then, professional sports teams didn't conduct the extensive background checks that are standard today, so Randall's troubling history went unnoticed by the organization. His teammates at Portland State remembered him as vain and somewhat lazy, afraid of getting hit, terrible qualities for a football player. Despite these obvious limitations, he had somehow convinced NFL scouts that he was worth a shot, but his professional football career would be shorter than a single preseason game. The Packers cut him during training camp on August 19th, 1974, ending his NFL dreams before they truly began. For most people, getting cut from an NFL team would be a disappointing setback. For Randall Woodfield, it was the moment his life took a much darker turn. Without the structure and purpose that football had provided, without the admiration and respect that came with being an athlete, Randall found himself adrift. And for a man who craved power and control, who had spent years getting away with increasingly serious crimes, this rejection would prove to be the catalyst for something far more sinister. By 1975, Randall had escalated from indecent exposure to armed robbery and sexual assault. He began stalking women in Portland, approaching them at knife point and forcing them to perform sexual acts while he robbed them. His method was simple but effective. He would target women who were alone, overpower them with the threat of violence, and then disappear before anyone could mount an effective response. Police finally caught up with him during a sting operation where undercover female officers posed as potential victims. When arrested, Randall confessed to his crimes, but in typical fashion, he tried to deflect responsibility. He blamed his actions on poor impulse control, which he claimed was caused by steroid use during his football career. It was classic Randall, admitting guilt while simultaneously playing the victim. He was charged with multiple counts of robbery and sexual assault, but in a plea deal that would prove catastrophic, he was allowed to plead guilty to reduced charges of second-degree robbery. The sexual assault charges were dropped, and he was sentenced to 10 years in Oregon State Penitentiary. It seemed like justice had finally caught up with him, but the system failed spectacularly. After serving only 4 years of his 10-year sentence, Randall was released on parole in July 1979. A serial sex offender who had shown no signs of rehabilitation, no remorse for his crimes, and no indication that he had any intention of changing his ways, was back on the streets. He walked out of prison unreformed, unrepentant, and more dangerous than ever. The timing of his release was almost poetic in its cruelty. Randall got out of prison just in time to attend his 10-year high school reunion, where he reconnected with former classmates who remembered him as the star athlete rather than the convicted felon. Among them was Cherie Lynn Ayers, an X-ray technician who had known Randall since second grade. They had attended the same schools in Newport, and during his imprisonment, they had corresponded through letters. Cherie was 29 years old, a University of Oregon graduate with her whole life ahead of her. She was engaged to be married and working in a job she loved. She represented everything normal and healthy that Randall had never been able to sustain. And on October 9th, 1980, he destroyed her. Cherie was found dead in her apartment on Southwest 9th Place in downtown Portland on October 11th, discovered by her fiancé when she failed to show up for work. She had been raped, beaten, and stabbed repeatedly in the neck. The brutality of the attack was shocking even to seasoned homicide detectives. This wasn't just murder, it was rage made manifest, the violent explosion of years of resentment and hatred. When police questioned Randall about Cherie's murder, he was evasive and deceptive, refusing to take a polygraph test. But because his blood type didn't match semen found at the crime scene, they couldn't charge him. DNA testing was still years away from being a standard investigative tool, so Randall walked away from his first known murder completely free. But Cherie's death wasn't an isolated incident. It was the beginning of a 5-month reign of terror that would span the entire West Coast. Randall had discovered something that gave him the ultimate rush, not just power over his victims, but the power of life and death itself. And with Interstate 5 stretching from California to Washington, he had the perfect hunting ground. Just over a month after Cherie's murder, on November 27th, 1980, Thanksgiving Day, Randall struck again. He arrived at the North Portland home of 22-year-old Darcy Renee Fix, planning to assault her sexually. When he discovered that her boyfriend, 24-year-old Douglas Keith Altig, was also present, Randall didn't retreat. Instead, he shot both of them to death with a .32 caliber revolver, execution style. The murders of Fix and Altig marked a new level of brutality and boldness for Randall. He was no longer just targeting lone women. He was willing to kill anyone who got in his way. And with 2 more bodies added to his count, he was gaining confidence with each successful crime. But Randall wasn't content with just murder. He also embarked on a series of armed robberies along the Interstate 5 corridor, targeting small businesses like gas stations, ice cream parlors, and convenience stores. These weren't robberies born of desperation or need. Randall came from a middle-class family and had no pressing financial concerns. These were crimes of power and control, opportunities to dominate and terrorize innocent people while building his war chest for more serious crimes. During these robberies, witnesses began to notice distinctive patterns. The robber was about 6 feet tall, with brown, curly hair and dark eyes. He often wore disguises, sometimes a fake beard, other times athletic tape or a bandage across the bridge of his nose, similar to what football players wear. It was as if he couldn't completely abandon his athletic identity, even while committing heinous crimes. The media dubbed him the I-5 Bandit, not yet realizing that robbery was just a sideline to his real passion: sexual violence and murder. Police departments along the West Coast were dealing with what they thought was a serial robber, but they had no idea they were actually tracking one of America's most dangerous killers. By January 1981, Randall's appetite for violence was escalating rapidly. On January 14th, he invaded a home occupied by two sisters, aged 8 and 10. In an act of unspeakable depravity, he ordered the children to undress and sexually assaulted them, forcing the older girl to perform oral sex. That he could victimize children with such calculated cruelty demonstrated just how far he had fallen into moral darkness. 4 days later, on January 18th, 1981, Randall entered the Transamerica office building in Kaiser, Oregon, where Sherry Hull and Beth Wilmot were working their evening cleaning shift. What happened in that building would finally bring his reign of terror to an end, but not before claiming another innocent life. Randall confronted both women at gunpoint, forcing them into a back room where he sexually assaulted them both. Then, with cold calculation, he shot each woman in the back of the head with his .32 caliber revolver. Sherry Hull died instantly, but Beth Wilmot, though critically wounded, managed to survive. Despite having a bullet lodged in her brain and suffering massive trauma, she somehow found the strength to call for help. Beth's survival would prove to be Randall's undoing. When police arrived at the scene, they found Sherry's body and Beth clinging to life. As Beth recovered in the hospital, she was able to provide investigators with a detailed description of her attacker. More importantly, she would later be able to identify Randall Woodfield in a police lineup, providing the crucial eyewitness testimony that would finally bring him to justice. But Randall wasn't finished. Even as police were processing the crime scene in Kaiser, he was already planning his next attacks. On February 3rd, 1981, he traveled to Northern California, where he broke into the home of 37-year-old Donna Eckerd and her 14-year-old daughter, Janelle Charlotte Jarvis, in Mountain Gate near Redding. He shot both mother and daughter multiple times in the head, leaving them dead in their bed. 2 weeks later, on February 15th, he murdered Julie Ann Wrights, an 18-year-old woman in Beaverton, Oregon. Julie had the misfortune of being a former girlfriend of Randall's, and he killed her in her own home with the same cold efficiency he had shown all his other victims. By this point, law enforcement agencies up and down the West Coast were beginning to connect the dots. The same .32 caliber weapon had been used in multiple murders. Witnesses were describing similar-looking attackers, and most tellingly, investigators noticed that the crimes were all clustered around Interstate 5, suggesting that the killer was using the highway system to move quickly between jurisdictions. What finally led police to Randall was his compulsive need to stay in contact with the numerous women he had been manipulating throughout his crime spree. Beaverton Police Chief David Bishop would later observe that Randall was addicted to the phone and had made thousands of calls to various girlfriends using calling cards at payphones near the murder sites. When investigators assembled a log of these phone calls, they found a pattern that matched perfectly with the timeline and locations of the I-5 murders. On March 7th, 1981, police arrested Randall Woodfield at his apartment in Springfield, Oregon. When they searched his residence, they found a spent .32 caliber bullet that matched the murder weapon, the same brand of tape he had used to bind his victims, and phone records that placed him near every single crime scene. The evidence was overwhelming, but perhaps the most damning evidence came from Beth Wilmot herself. Despite the massive trauma she had suffered, she was able to positively identify Randall in a police lineup. Her courage in facing the man who had tried to kill her would prove instrumental in securing his conviction. The trial began in June 1981 in Salem, Oregon, with Chris Van Dyke, son of actor Dick Van Dyke, serving as the Marion County District Attorney. Van Dyke would later describe Randall as the coldest, most detached defendant I've ever seen. Throughout the proceedings, Randall maintained his innocence, showing no remorse for his crimes and no empathy for his victims. Beth Wilmot's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Despite everything she had endured, she faced her attacker with remarkable strength and composure, providing clear and detailed testimony about the night that changed her life forever. Her courage in the face of unimaginable trauma exemplified the best of human resilience in the face of pure evil. On June 26th, 1981, after just 3.5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Randall Woodfield guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 90 years for the murder of Sherry Hull, the attempted murder of Beth Wilmot, and multiple counts of sodomy. But that wasn't the end of Randall's legal troubles. In October 1981, he faced additional charges in Benton County for attacking a woman in a restaurant bathroom. He was convicted of sodomy and weapons charges, adding another 35 years to his sentence. These additional convictions ensured that even if there were problems with his murder conviction, he would still spend the rest of his life behind bars. As forensic technology advanced in the decades following his imprisonment, DNA testing would eventually link Randall to additional murders. In 2001, DNA evidence definitively connected him to Sherry Ayer's 1980 murder, finally providing scientific proof of what investigators had suspected all along. Additional testing in 2006 linked him to even more killings, expanding the scope of his confirmed crimes. Today, authorities believe Randall Woodfield may have been responsible for as many as 44 murders and 60 rapes, making him one of the deadliest serial killers in American history. The true scope of his crimes may never be fully known, as many of his victims were transient women whose disappearances went unreported or uninvestigated. Randall remains incarcerated at the Oregon State Penitentiary, where he is now 73 years old. He has never confessed to any of his crimes, never shown remorse for the lives he destroyed, and never provided closure to the families of his victims. He has married and divorced multiple times while in prison, continuing to manipulate women even from behind bars. The case of Randall Woodfield serves as a chilling reminder that evil can wear any face, including that of the all-American athlete. His story exposes the dangerous tendency to overlook warning signs when they come from someone society wants to admire. How many lives might have been saved if his early crimes had been taken seriously? How many victims might still be alive if he had served his full 10-year sentence? The women and men who fell victim to the I-5 killer were more than just statistics in a criminal case. Cherie Ayers was planning a wedding. Sherry Hull was working to support herself through college. Darcy Fix and Douglas Altig were young lovers, with their whole lives ahead of them. Donna Eckerd was a mother trying to provide for her teenage daughter. Each of them had dreams, hopes, and people who loved them. Beth Wilmot, the brave survivor whose testimony helped bring Randall to justice, went on to rebuild her life despite the trauma she endured. Her courage in facing her attacker and her strength in moving forward represent the triumph of the human spirit over evil. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Randall Woodfield's story is how easily he moved through society, how readily people trusted him, and how his crimes were initially overlooked because of his status as an athlete. He babysat children, charmed women, and maintained the facade of respectability, even as he left a trail of bodies in his wake. The I-5 killer case changed how law enforcement agencies coordinate across jurisdictions, leading to better communication and information sharing that has helped catch other serial killers. It also highlighted the importance of taking sexual crimes seriously, regardless of the perpetrator's social status or perceived respectability. Randall Woodfield will spend the rest of his days in a prison cell, but the damage he inflicted extends far beyond his immediate victims. Families were shattered, communities were terrorized, and faith in human nature was shaken. His story serves as a stark reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the boy next door, the star athlete, the guy everyone thinks they can trust. And that might be the most terrifying truth of all. Evil doesn't need horns and fangs to destroy lives. Sometimes all it needs is a charming smile and a football uniform. In the small town of Nocona, Texas, where everyone knew everyone and trust was as common as Texas heat, there lived a woman most people considered an angel. She had soft eyes, a gentle voice, and hands that seemed to heal. She was the nurse you wanted when you were sick, the caregiver who would sit by your bedside and hold your hand when pain kept you awake at night. Her name was Vicki Dawn Jackson, and she was everything you'd want in a healthcare provider. Sweet, caring, devoted to her patients. But what the people of Nocona didn't know, what no one could have imagined, was that those same gentle hands that comforted the dying were also the hands that were killing them. Vicki Dawn Carson was born on February 13th, 1966, in Montague County, Texas. From the time she was a little girl, she dreamed of becoming Florence Nightingale. She wanted to heal people, to make them better, to be the person families turned to in their darkest hours. And for years, that's exactly what she seemed to be. By 1989, Vicki had become a licensed vocational nurse. She worked at several hospitals and nursing homes around North Texas, building a reputation as someone who genuinely cared about her patients. She was quiet, professional, the kind of nurse who would stay late to make sure someone was comfortable or come in early to check on a patient who was having a rough night. In late 2000, Vicki found employment at Nocona General Hospital, a modest 38-bed facility that served the rural community. Despite its small size, the hospital was considered one of the top 100 facilities in the nation. It primarily treated elderly patients with minor ailments, people coming in for foot sores, diarrhea, or dementia-related issues. Nothing life-threatening, nothing that should have resulted in death. Vicky worked the night shift, the quiet hours when the hospital was dimly lit and most patients were sleeping. It was during these lonely midnight hours that families trusted her to watch over their loved ones. And for a while, that trust seemed well placed. But something inside Vicky was changing. Maybe it was the stress from her personal life. She'd been married and divorced multiple times, lost custody of her children, and felt like her world was falling apart. Maybe it was something darker, something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to surface. On December 11th, 2000, at the age of 34, Vicky made a decision that would transform her from a healer into something monstrous. She filled a syringe with mivacurium chloride, a powerful muscle relaxant normally kept on crash carts for emergency procedures. The drug, also known as Mivacron, was designed to temporarily paralyze a patient's respiratory system during certain medical procedures. In the right dose, administered by trained professionals, it was a useful tool. In the wrong hands, it was a weapon. Vicky began walking up and down the hospital's hallway, syringe in hand, looking for a patient to murder. What made mivacurium chloride so terrifying was how it killed. When injected into an elderly or fragile patient, the drug would cause their muscles to stop working. They would be fully conscious, fully aware of what was happening, but unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to call for help. They would suffocate while completely paralyzed, trapped inside their own bodies as death slowly took hold. As one doctor later said, "It's about the cruelest way to kill somebody." And that's exactly what Vicky wanted. Between December 2000 and February 2001, Nocona General Hospital recorded an unprecedented surge in patient deaths. All of the victims were between 62 and 100 years old, people who had come to the hospital for minor issues and should have gone home within days. Instead, they died sudden, unexplained deaths during the night shift. Vicky's shift. The pattern was always the same. A patient would be doing well, recovering from their minor ailment, maybe even preparing to go home the next day. Then, during the night, they would suddenly stop breathing. By the time other staff arrived, it was too late. The patient was dead, and Vicky would be there standing quietly by the bedside, having discovered the body. What made Vicky particularly cruel was how she chose her victims. These weren't random killings. She targeted people who had somehow slighted her, who had made her angry, or who represented something she wanted to destroy. 80-year-old J.T. Nichols was in the hospital with pneumonia. He died on January 11th, 2001, after Vicky injected him with Mivacron. John Walter Williams, 78, also died on January 11th. His crime? Being under Vicky's care on the wrong night. On January 24th, 95-year-old Oma Ovella Glenn Weiler was preparing to go home after being treated for congestive heart failure. She was stable, recovering, ready to return to her family. Vicky gave her an injection of Mivacron. Weiler stopped breathing. It was actually the second time Vicky had tried to kill her. This time, she succeeded. But perhaps the most chilling murder was that of 82-year-old Orville Lee Moore Jr. His only mistake was calling Vicky a fat ass during his stay. On January 30th, 2001, She made him pay for that insult with his life, injecting him with the paralytic drug and watching him die. The final confirmed murder was perhaps the most personal. On February 4th, 2001, Everett E. Preacher Jackson, a 91-year-old former cotton farmer, was admitted to the hospital with a high fever and cellulitis. Preacher Jackson was the grandfather of Vicky's husband, Kirk. Whether this was revenge against her husband or simply an opportunity to kill someone she had access to, Vicky walked into his room and murdered him. Later that night, she calmly walked up to the nurse's station and in a quiet voice announced that she believed Preacher Jackson was dead. She then told her husband, who went outside and wept for the grandfather he'd lost to what he thought was natural causes. But it wasn't just the murders that made Vicky terrifying. It was her method, her coldness, and the fact that she was killing people who trusted her completely. One surviving victim, 61-year-old Donnelly Reed, a polio patient, later described how Vicky had come into his room and injected something into his IV tube. Reed felt himself losing consciousness, unable to move or breathe, and was only saved when another nurse came to check on him. He survived the attack, but died 2 months later from pneumonia. Another survivor, a young woman named Lydia Diane Weatherred, had been targeted because she had rejected the romantic advances of Vicky's son. When Weatherred was admitted to the hospital, Vicky saw it as an opportunity for revenge. She injected the young woman with muscle relaxant, but somehow Weatherred survived. What made the investigation so difficult was that Vicky was careful. She didn't leave obvious evidence. The drug she used was not a controlled substance, so when vials went missing from the crash carts, the hospital simply replaced them without asking questions. The deaths appeared natural at first glance. Elderly patients with pre-existing conditions dying at night. It wasn't until the pattern became impossible to ignore that anyone suspected foul play. In early 2001, hospital administrators began to notice something disturbing. During December and January, they had recorded twice the normal number of deaths. Even accounting for flu season, the numbers were suspicious. When they looked closer, they realized that all of the suspicious deaths had occurred during the night shift, Vicky's shift. On February 6th, 2001, hospital CEO Charles Norris met with Nokona's police chief, Kent Holcomb, to discuss their concerns. Holcomb immediately called in the Texas Rangers and the FBI. A joint investigation was launched, but they faced a serious problem. They had no physical evidence. To catch Vicky in the act, investigators set up a hidden camera aimed at the supply of mivacurium chloride, hoping to catch her stealing vials. But before they could gather evidence, the hospital made a crucial mistake. 2 days after they discovered that Donnelly Reed had been attacked, they fired Vicky. Without cause, without explanation, they simply let her go. Vicky found a new job at a local grocery store, working in the deli department making sandwiches. She seemed to have escaped justice, but the investigation was far from over. Bodies began to be exhumed from cemeteries across North Texas and Oklahoma. 10 bodies in total, all people who had died at Nocona General during Vicky's killing spree. Toxicology reports would later confirm what investigators suspected. Each victim had been injected with lethal doses of mivacurium chloride. When FBI agents searched Vicky's home, they found a discarded syringe in her garbage. Traces of the paralytic drug were still detectable. They also discovered something chilling: a sealed box that Vicky had given to her daughter Jennifer contained information about Mivacron, newspaper clippings about hospital deaths, and Vicky's handwritten notes. On July 16th, 2002, Vicky Dawn Jackson was arrested at the grocery store where she worked. She was charged with 4 counts of capital murder, with additional charges coming later as more evidence was uncovered. During FBI interrogations, Vicky initially denied everything, but eventually she admitted to injecting at least one patient with mivacurium chloride, claiming she only wanted to sedate him and never meant to hurt him. FBI Special Agent David Burns testified that through multiple interrogations, he determined that Vicky had killed patients in fits of anger for being too demanding, and that she had attempted to injure several others, including a 14-year-old girl and a 40-year-old woman suffering from Crohn's disease. What investigators discovered was that Vicky's motive wasn't mercy or attention seeking like other healthcare serial killers. She killed out of pure malice. She wanted people dead, lots of people, and she enjoyed watching them suffer. She targeted those who had slighted her, those who were too demanding, those who reminded her of people she hated. Vicky's first trial ended in a mistrial when the judge determined that comments made by the prosecutor had prejudiced the jury. At her second trial, the full scope of her crimes became clear. She was charged with 10 counts of capital murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Rather than face a jury verdict, on October 3, 2006, Vicky Dawn Jackson pleaded no contest to all charges. Her defense attorney said she made this decision because her adult daughter was scheduled to testify against her, and she couldn't bear to put Jennifer through that ordeal. On October 5, 2006, Vicky Dawn Jackson was sentenced to life in prison. She never confessed, never showed remorse, never explained why she had chosen to become a killer instead of a healer. Today, Vicky remains incarcerated at the Christina Melton Crane Unit in Gatesville, Texas. She is eligible for parole on July 16, 2042, at the earliest, when she will be 76 years old. The people of Nocona still struggle to understand how someone they trusted, someone they thought of as an angel of mercy, could have been the angel of death. Families who had thanked Vicky for caring for their loved ones in their final moments now realized that she had been the one to cause those final moments. What makes Vicky Dawn Jackson so terrifying isn't just the number of people she killed, though at least 10 confirmed murders and possibly 20 more make her one of the most prolific healthcare serial killers in American history. It's not just the method she used, though the paralytic drug represents one of the cruelest ways to kill another human being. What makes her truly monstrous is the betrayal of trust. These were people who came to her in their most vulnerable moments, seeking healing and comfort. Instead, they found a predator who saw their weakness as an opportunity. She used her position, her training, and her access to deadly drugs to satisfy her need for control and revenge. In a profession dedicated to preserving life, Vicky Dawn Jackson chose to take it. In a place where people came to heal, she brought death. And in a small town where everyone trusted everyone, she proved that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like nurses, with gentle hands and caring smiles. Sometimes they look like angels until the moment they reveal themselves to be demons. The case of Vicki Dawn Jackson serves as a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind any facade, in any profession, in any small town where people think they're safe. Her victims trusted her with their lives, and she repaid that trust with murder. They went to sleep expecting to wake up healed, and instead never woke up at all. In the end, the woman who wanted to be Florence Nightingale became something else entirely. She became a nightmare that haunted not just her victims and their families, but an entire community that learned that sometimes the person you trust most is the one you should fear the most. In the spring of 1988, in the old fishing port of New Bedford, Massachusetts, where the cobblestone streets still echo with stories of whaling ships and Moby Dick, something evil was stirring. It started slowly, quietly, the way most nightmares do. A woman would leave her apartment at night, maybe to work the streets, maybe to score drugs, maybe just to escape whatever pain was waiting for her at home, and then she would vanish. At first, nobody noticed. These were women society had forgotten, women battling addiction, women surviving on the margins. When they disappeared, there were no Amber Alerts, no search parties, no news crews, just empty beds and unanswered phone calls that eventually stopped coming altogether. But someone was watching, someone was hunting, and what he was about to do would turn this historic New England town into a graveyard. Weld Square in New Bedford was a place most people avoided after dark. In 1988, it was ground zero for the city's heroin epidemic, a place where addiction and desperation collided in the shadows of abandoned buildings. The crack houses and shooting galleries were filled with broken souls trying to numb pain that never seemed to end. It was here, among the forgotten and the lost, that a killer found his hunting ground. The women who worked these streets had one thing in common: they were invisible. Society had given up on them long before they disappeared. Most were mothers trying to feed their children, daughters who had lost their way, sisters battling demons they couldn't defeat. To the outside world, they were statistics, problems to be ignored. To their families, they were everything. But to him, they were something else entirely. They were prey. On July the 3rd, 1988, a woman walking her dog through the woods alongside Route 140 in Freetown made a discovery that would haunt her forever. There, lying in the brush just yards from the highway, was the decomposed body of a woman. She was positioned on her back, feet pointing toward the road, as if she had been carefully arranged for someone to find. The victim was identified as Deborah Medeiros, a 29-year-old from Fall River. She had been missing since late May, vanishing after a fight with her boyfriend. The medical examiner determined she had been strangled, a bra wrapped around her neck like a grotesque necklace. Her boyfriend was quickly ruled out as a suspect. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was something calculated, methodical, cold. What police didn't know yet was that Deborah was just the beginning. Less than a month later, on July the 30th, two men riding motorcycles along Interstate 195 in Dartmouth spotted something that made them pull over and call 911. Another body, another woman, positioned in exactly the same way. On her back, feet pointing toward the highway, nude and decomposed beyond easy recognition. This was Nancy Paiva, 36, who had last been seen walking home from a bar called Whispers Pub in the early morning hours of July 7th. She had gotten into a fight with her boyfriend and stormed out into the night. Like Deborah, she had been strangled. Like Deborah, she was found in the same ritualistic position. That's when investigators began to understand they weren't dealing with isolated murders. They were hunting a serial killer. By November 1988, the body count had risen to 5. Deborah Greenlaw DeMello, 35, was found off the Reed Road exit of Interstate 195, her clothing scattered in the tree branches above her nude body. In a chilling detail that would later prove significant, some of her belongings were mixed with items that belonged to Nancy Paiva, suggesting the killer was keeping trophies, collecting mementos from his victims. Dawn Mendez, 25, was discovered off Route 140 in Freetown, identified only through fingerprints and dental records. Her body was so badly decomposed that her own family could barely recognize her. Deborah Lynn McConnell, 25, was found just days later on December 1st, also along Route 140. She had been missing since May, last seen at her mother's funeral. The killer had taken her during one of the most vulnerable moments of her life, when she was already drowning in grief. The pattern was becoming clear and terrifying. All the victims were women struggling with addiction or involved in sex work. All had been strangled. All were found nude, dumped along the highways that crisscrossed the New Bedford area like a spider's web of death. And all were positioned in the same way, feet pointing toward the road, as if the killer was directing traffic to his handiwork. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. On December 10th, 1988, searchers found the body of Rochelle Clifford Dopiarala, and with her discovery, the investigation took a shocking turn. Rochelle was different from the other victims. She had been beaten to death, not strangled. She was found clothed, not nude. And most importantly, she had connections that would lead investigators straight to their prime suspect. Rochelle had been the roommate of Nancy Paiva, the second victim. She had recently testified against a man who had raped her, and she had been dating a lawyer named Kenneth Ponte, a man who would soon become the focus of the most intensive murder investigation in Massachusetts history. Kenneth Ponte was not your typical suspect. He was a respected attorney in New Bedford, a deputy sheriff with political connections and a law practice. But beneath his professional exterior, Ponte was living a double life that would shock even seasoned investigators. Ponte was a heroin addict, injecting cocaine into nearly every vein in his body. He frequented the same streets where the victims worked, cruising Weld Square in search of drugs and women. He knew several of the victims personally. Mary Rose Santos had been his client in a civil case. Robin Rhodes, who would later become a victim, had dated him. When Santos went missing, Ponte had even helped her husband make missing person flyers, all while potentially knowing exactly where she was. As investigators dug deeper into Ponte's life, a disturbing picture emerged. Former girlfriends came forward with stories of violence and threats. Diane Doherty, a 37-year-old woman from Lynn, told authorities that Ponte had held her against her will in his Florida home, choking her and holding a gun to her head. She described a man consumed by drugs and rage, capable of unspeakable violence. The investigation revealed that Ponte had a pattern of using women to obtain drugs for him, recruiting them from the same vulnerable population that the killer was targeting. When these women became liabilities, when they threatened to expose his drug use or illegal activities, they had a tendency to disappear. But Ponte was smart, careful, and well connected. Despite mounting evidence and intense scrutiny, he managed to stay one step ahead of investigators. In September 1988, just as the bodies were piling up, Ponte quietly moved to Port Richey, Florida, far from the investigation that was closing in around him. The break investigators had been waiting for came through Rochelle Dopieralla's murder. Unlike the highway victims, Rochelle's killing could be directly linked to Ponte. Prosecutors believed he had beaten her to death to prevent her from testifying against him about his drug activities. On August 17, 1990, a grand jury indicted Kenneth Ponte for the murder of Rochelle Clifford Dopierala. Ponte was arrested in Florida and brought back to Massachusetts to face charges. At his arraignment, he entered a plea of absolutely not guilty and posted a $50,000 bond. But even as he proclaimed his innocence, the weight of evidence seemed to be building against him. Then, just as it seemed justice might finally be served, everything began to unravel. The case against Ponte was largely built on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of witnesses whose credibility could be easily challenged. His victims were women with histories of drug use and prostitution, making it difficult to establish concrete timelines or reliable witness accounts. The bodies had been left exposed to the elements for months, destroying most physical evidence. But the real blow to the prosecution came with the emergence of another suspect, a man whose death would cast doubt on everything investigators thought they knew about the case. Anthony DeGrazia was a muscular stonemason from New Bedford with a reputation for violence against sex workers. He had been convicted of 17 rapes and sexual assaults, all targeting the same vulnerable population as the highway killer's victims. Several witnesses described him as having a particular fondness for choking women, which matched the killer's method of strangulation. In 1989, DeGrazia had been questioned about the murders, but never charged. He was released from prison in June 1990 after serving time for the sexual assaults. 1 month later, on July 17, 1990, his body was found face down under a picnic table in the backyard of his ex-girlfriend's parents' home in Freetown. The circumstances of DeGrazia's death were immediately suspicious. The initial responding officers from Freetown Police ruled it a homicide based on the scene evidence. The autopsy report also concluded that DeGrazia had been murdered, but in a decision that would fuel conspiracy theories for decades, the district attorney's office overruled both findings and declared the death a suicide. The timing was especially suspicious. DeGrazia died just after Special Prosecutor Paul Buckley had released Kenneth Ponte as the prime suspect and was reportedly considering DeGrazia as the new focus of the investigation. Authorities publicly stated that it was timely that DeGrazia had taken his own life after learning he was being considered as the #1 suspect. But DeGrazia's family never believed he committed suicide. They filed a lawsuit alleging that he had been murdered, possibly by the real killer or by someone trying to protect the real killer. The autopsy evidence, they argued, clearly showed signs of homicide that had been covered up for political reasons. With DeGrazia dead and unable to defend himself, he became a convenient scapegoat for the unsolved murders. On July 29, 1991, the charges against Kenneth Ponte were dropped, citing lack of evidence. The remaining drug and assault charges were also dismissed. The case went cold, leaving families without answers and a killer free to strike again. But the story of the New Bedford Highway Killer was far from over. In 1992 and 1993, a series of eerily similar murders occurred in Lisbon, Portugal. 3 sex workers were killed and disemboweled, while 2 others were shot dead. The similarities to the New Bedford case were so striking that Portuguese police traveled to Massachusetts to study the investigation, while FBI agents went to Lisbon to compare evidence. The theory that the same killer might be responsible for murders on 2 continents was both terrifying and plausible. A killer sophisticated enough to evade capture in New Bedford could easily have fled to Europe to continue his spree. But like so many aspects of this case, the international connection remained unproven. Meanwhile, other suspects emerged and faded away. Daniel Thomas Tavares Jr., while imprisoned for murdering his mother, sent a threatening letter indirectly claiming responsibility for the highway killings. He had lived in New Bedford and demonstrated knowledge about where one of the victims, Gail Botelho, had been buried. In 2015, he was convicted of Botelho's murder, but his connection to the other highway killings remained unclear. Kenneth Ponte continued to live under the shadow of suspicion until his death in 2010. In his final years, he had become a pathetic figure, reduced to shoplifting sardines and cheese from a grocery store. He was found dead in his New Bedford home, alone and forgotten, taking whatever secrets he might have had to the grave. The investigation officially remains open, but with each passing year, the chances of solving the case grow smaller. The physical evidence has long since degraded. Key witnesses have died. Memories have faded. The highways where the bodies were dumped have been repaved countless times, erasing any traces of the horror that once unfolded along their shoulders. What makes the New Bedford Highway Killer case so haunting isn't just the brutality of the murders or the fact that the killer was never caught. It's the systematic way society failed these women, both in life and in death. They were dismissed, ignored, and forgotten because of their addictions and their circumstances. When they were murdered, the investigation was hampered by the same prejudices that had marginalized them in life. These women had names, families, dreams that were cut short by a predator who understood that society wouldn't fight very hard for their justice. Deborah Medeiros had a boyfriend who loved her. Nancy Paiva had a sister who worked for the city. Deborah DeMello came from a middle-class family before drugs pulled her into a darker world. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, friends. The killer knew this. He understood that by targeting the most vulnerable women in society, he could operate with near impunity. He could dump their bodies along busy highways, confident that the investigation would be half-hearted, that the media attention would be minimal, that society would quickly move on to more worthy victims. And in many ways, he was right. But families like Wayne Perry, Deborah DeMello's brother, refused to let these women be forgotten. Perry has spent decades fighting for answers, creating Facebook pages dedicated to the case, following up on tips, pressuring authorities to keep the investigation active. He knows that somewhere out there, the killer might still be alive, might still be a threat. The New Bedford Highway killer case remains one of New England's greatest unsolved mysteries. 11 women vanished from the same area between March 1988 and April 1989. 9 bodies were found. 2 women, Christina Montero and Marilyn Cardoza Roberts, remain missing to this day, their families still hoping for closure that may never come. Recent advances in DNA technology have solved cold cases from the same era, giving hope that the New Bedford Highway killer might finally be identified. But without preserved evidence or clear suspects, even modern forensics may not be enough to crack this case. What we know for certain is that for more than a year, a predator stalked the streets of New Bedford, selecting his victims from among the most vulnerable members of society. He strangled them, dumped their bodies along highways like discarded trash, and disappeared back into whatever shadows had produced him. He might have been Kenneth Ponte, the drug-addicted lawyer with connections to multiple victims. He might have been Anthony DeGracia, the violent stonemason whose convenient death raised more questions than it answered. He might have been someone else entirely, someone who has lived with his secret for more than 3 decades. But whoever the New Bedford Highway killer was, he understood something dark about human nature, that some victims matter more than others, that some murders receive more attention than others, that some killers can hide in plain sight, because their victims come from a world most people prefer to pretend doesn't exist. The highways around New Bedford still carry their traffic, commuters and travelers passing over ground that once held the remains of murdered women. Most drivers have no idea they're traveling through what was once a serial killer's dumping ground. The victims' names have faded from headlines, their stories relegated to true crime podcasts and cold case files. But they were real people with real lives that mattered. They deserved better than the world they lived in, and they deserved better than the justice system that failed them after death. Their killer may never be caught. Their families may never get closure, but their stories serve as a reminder that evil can flourish in the shadows of society's indifference. The New Bedford Highway killer remains free, his identity unknown, his crimes unpunished. Somewhere, he might be living a quiet life, his dark secret buried beneath decades of normalcy. Or he might be dead, taking his confession to the grave. But the women he killed, the lives he destroyed, the families he shattered, they remain, waiting for a justice that may never come. In the end, the most terrifying thing about the New Bedford Highway killer isn't just that he murdered 11 women and got away with it. It's that he understood exactly which victims he could take without society fighting back. He knew that these women's lives would be valued less, their deaths investigated less thoroughly, their killers pursued less aggressively. And for more than 30 years, he's been proven right. On a calm February morning in 2009, Christine Ross clipped the leash onto her dog Ruka and stepped out into the crisp New Mexico air. The West Mesa stretched before them, a vast expanse of high desert landscape dotted with sagebrush and marked by the distant outline of the Sandia Mountains. It was the kind of peaceful walk they took every day through their suburban Albuquerque neighborhood, where families gathered in spacious yards and children played on quiet streets. Nothing about this morning suggested that within the next hour, Christine and Ruka would stumble upon what investigators would later call the largest serial killer crime scene in American history. As they followed their usual path along a dried out wash, Ruka began sniffing at something protruding from the sandy soil. At first, Christine thought it was just another stick or piece of debris that desert winds had scattered across the mesa. But the closer she looked, the more disturbed she became. The object was white, weathered, and distinctly bone-like. She pulled out her phone, snapped a photo, and immediately texted it to her sister, a registered nurse. The response came back quickly and chilled her to the bone. "That looks like a human femur." With trembling fingers, Christine dialed 911. She had no idea that her call would launch an investigation that would uncover the remains of 11 women and one unborn child, all victims of a predator who had been hunting in the shadows for years. The killer had chosen this remote corner of the West Mesa as his personal graveyard, a place where he could dispose of bodies without fear of discovery. But now, thanks to a curious dog and her observant owner, his secret was about to be exposed. What the police found in the weeks that followed was nothing short of horrifying. Buried in shallow graves across an undeveloped stretch of desert were the skeletal remains of women who had vanished between 2001 and 2005. They ranged in age from just 15 to 32 years old. Most were Hispanic, though one was African American. All but one had ties to sex work or drug addiction, making them part of a vulnerable population that often goes unnoticed when they disappear. The victims included Jamie Barella, just 15 years old, who had vanished along with her 27-year-old cousin, Evelyn Salazar, after leaving a family gathering to visit a local park. There was Monica Candelaria, 22, who disappeared on a spring evening in 2003. Victoria Chavez, 26, had been missing since June of that same year. 15-year-old Selania Edwards had traveled from Oklahoma only to end up among the dead in this New Mexico desert. And Michelle Valdez, 22 years old and 4 months pregnant when she died, her unborn child's remains found alongside her own. As investigators processed the crime scene, they realized they were dealing with something unprecedented. The precision of the burials, the careful selection of the location, and the sheer number of victims all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. A serial killer had been operating in Albuquerque for years, systematically targeting and murdering women with almost complete impunity. The killer came to be known as the West Mesa Bone Collector, a name that captured both the cold calculation of his crimes and the macabre nature of what he left behind. But unlike other infamous serial killers who sought notoriety or left elaborate calling cards, this predator seemed determined to remain invisible. He had chosen his victims carefully, targeting women whose disappearances might go unnoticed or be dismissed by society. He had selected a burial ground that was remote yet accessible, a place where he could work undisturbed. Detective Ida Lopez had been preparing for this discovery long before Ruka found that first bone. Years earlier, she had begun compiling a list of missing women from the Albuquerque area, focusing on those with ties to prostitution and drug addiction who had vanished without a trace. 10 of the women found on the West Mesa were on her list, but Lopez suspected there might be more victims still out there, and she was right. 8 other women with similar backgrounds remain missing to this day, their fates unknown. The investigation that followed was massive and exhaustive. FBI profilers were brought in to create a psychological portrait of the killer. Hundreds of interviews were conducted. Timelines were constructed for every potential suspect. But the bone collector had been careful, leaving virtually no physical evidence behind. The decomposed state of the remains made it impossible to determine exactly how the women had died, though investigators suspected strangulation based on the lack of obvious trauma to the bones. One of the most chilling aspects of the case was what satellite imagery revealed about the burial site. Google Earth photos from 2004 showed tire tracks leading directly to the area where the bodies were eventually found. But by the time the remains were discovered in 2009, housing development had erased any hope of recovering physical evidence from those tracks. The killer had operated during a narrow window when the area was still remote enough for his activities, but before it became a bustling suburban neighborhood. As the investigation progressed, several suspects emerged from the shadows of Albuquerque's underworld. Fred Reynolds was a pimp who knew one of the missing women and reportedly kept photographs of sex workers who had disappeared. He died of natural causes in January 2009, just weeks before the bodies were discovered. Lorenzo Montoya lived less than 3 miles from the burial site, and in 2006, investigators noted dirt trails leading from his trailer park directly to the area where the bodies were found. Montoya's history painted the picture of a dangerous predator. He had been arrested multiple times for assaulting sex workers and had even threatened to kill his girlfriend and bury her body in lime. Co-workers later claimed he had bragged about killing and burying women on the West Mesa. But Montoya's story came to a violent end in December 2006 when he strangled 19-year-old Sharika Hill, a sex worker he had met in an online chat room. When Hill's pimp followed Montoya to his home and found him trying to dispose of her body, he shot and killed Montoya on the spot. The timing of Montoya's death was significant. The disappearances that had plagued Albuquerque for years seemed to stop after he was killed. But despite the circumstantial evidence pointing to him as the West Mesa bone collector, investigators could never definitively prove his guilt. Without DNA evidence or a direct connection to the burial site, Montoya remained a suspect, but never a confirmed killer. Another name that surfaced during the investigation was Joseph Blee, a convicted serial rapist with a disturbing history. Known as the mid-school rapist for his attacks on teenage girls in the 1980s, Blee had an extensive criminal record and had been in contact with police over 130 times between 1990 and 2009. His ex-wife came forward just days after the bones were discovered, urging police to investigate him. According to court documents, Blee's DNA had been found on a dead prostitute in 1985, though he was never charged in connection with that crime. What made Blee particularly suspicious was his pattern of behavior in the area where the West Mesa victims had worked. Police surveillance showed him repeatedly cruising East Central Avenue, the corridor where many of the missing women had last been seen. He appeared to be stalking sex workers, though he never seemed to approach them during the surveillance. Despite being questioned extensively and even having his property searched, Blia was never charged in connection with the West Mesa murders. He remains in prison, serving a 90-year sentence for sexual assaults unrelated to the case. The investigation also explored the possibility that the murders were connected to organized crime or human trafficking. The presence of Selania Edwards, the 15-year-old from Oklahoma, among the victims suggested that the killer might have had connections beyond Albuquerque. Anonymous tips linked the murders to suspects from El Salvador and suggested the involvement of a sex trafficking ring operating throughout the Southwest. This theory gained traction when investigators realized that several of the victims had disappeared around the time of major events like the New Mexico State Fair, when increased traffic might provide cover for criminal activity. But despite years of investigation, hundreds of interviews, and extensive forensic analysis, the West Mesa bone collector remained an enigma. The case went cold, with only one detective remaining full-time on the investigation by 2016. Mark Morani had interviewed over 200 local women with similar backgrounds to the victims and created detailed timelines for every suspect. But the breakthrough that would solve the case continued to elude him. The impact of these murders extended far beyond the families of the victims. The discovery of the mass grave forced Albuquerque to confront uncomfortable truths about how society treats its most vulnerable members. The fact that 11 women could disappear over the course of several years without their absences being widely noticed highlighted the invisibility of sex workers and drug addicts in the community. Christine Barber, who founded Safe Streets New Mexico to help women escape prostitution, put it bluntly. That's why the West Mesa killer was able to do it. No one noticed they were gone. The murders exposed the dangerous reality faced by women working on the streets, where the threat of violence is constant and the likelihood of justice is slim. The families of the victims fought to ensure their loved ones were remembered as more than just statistics in a serial killer case. Michelle Valdez's father, Dan, described how his daughter's smile could light up any room and emphasized that she was a beautiful person worthy of love and remembrance. The victims were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends who had struggled with addiction and difficult circumstances but deserved dignity in death. As the years passed, the West Mesa became a symbol of both tragedy and resilience. A memorial park was built over the acre where the bodies were found, providing a place for families to grieve and remember their lost loved ones. But the surrounding area continued to develop, with new homes and businesses sprouting up across the mesa. Some investigators wonder if more bodies remain hidden beneath the foundation of these new structures. The case also raised disturbing questions about other unsolved disappearances. In 2010, police released photographs of 7 unidentified women who might also be connected to the West Mesa murders. The origins of these photos were never explained, and while 2 of the women were eventually found alive, the others remained mysteries. The images showed women who appeared unconscious or distressed, suggesting they might have been victims of the same predator who killed the 11 women found on the mesa. Today, more than 15 years after that February morning when Christine Ross and Ruka made their grim discovery, the West Mesa bone collector case remains officially unsolved. The Albuquerque Police Department continues to treat it as an active investigation, and a $100,000 reward is still offered for information leading to an arrest and conviction. But as time passes, the likelihood of solving the case grows increasingly remote. The investigation has been hampered by several factors beyond the killer's careful planning. DNA evidence has degraded over time, making it difficult to extract useful genetic material from the remains. Potential witnesses may be reluctant to come forward, either out of fear of the perpetrator or distrust of law enforcement. And without a clear crime scene where the actual murders took place, investigators lack the physical evidence that might normally help solve such cases. Some experts believe the West Mesa bone collector may no longer be alive. The sudden cessation of disappearances after Montoya's death in 2006 suggests that the killer might have been eliminated along with him. Others theorize that the perpetrator simply moved to a different location or changed his methods to avoid detection. The transient nature of serial killers means they can disappear as suddenly as they emerge, leaving behind only questions and grief. But there's another possibility that haunts investigators and families alike, that the bone collector is still out there, still hunting, still claiming victims in ways that haven't yet been discovered. The careful planning and execution of the West Mesa murders suggest a killer who was methodical, patient, and capable of adapting to changing circumstances. Such a predator doesn't simply stop killing, he evolves. The legacy of the West Mesa bone collector extends beyond the specific crimes he committed. The case has become a stark reminder of society's failure to protect its most vulnerable members and the ease with which predators can exploit those failures. It has highlighted the need for better resources and support for women involved in sex work and struggling with addiction, and it has shown how quickly victims can become invisible when they don't fit society's definition of the worthy dead. For the families of the 11 women found on the West Mesa, the lack of closure remains a constant source of pain. They continue to advocate for their loved ones, fighting against the tendency to dismiss the victims as people who brought their fate upon themselves. They remind anyone who will listen that these were human beings with hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. The investigation continues, driven by dedicated detectives who refuse to let the case fade into obscurity. New technologies in DNA analysis and forensic investigation offer hope that evidence previously thought useless might yield new clues. Cold case units across the country have had success solving decades-old murders using techniques that weren't available when the crimes were first committed. But for now, the West Mesa bone collector remains what he apparently always wanted to be: invisible, unknown, and unpunished. Somewhere out there, possibly within the very community he terrorized, a killer walks free. He may be your neighbor, your co-worker, or the friendly man who nods hello as you pass on the street. He may have moved on to other hunting grounds, or he may have simply learned to hide his victims more carefully. The women buried on the West Mesa deserved better in life, and they deserve justice in death. Their stories serve as a reminder that evil often hides in plain sight, preying on those society has forgotten or dismissed. Until the West Mesa bone collector is identified and brought to justice, their murders remain a wound that refuses to heal, a mystery that haunts the high desert landscape of New Mexico and a warning that monsters don't always announce themselves with fanfare. They sometimes operate in silence, collecting bones instead of trophies, and disappearing into the crowd when their work is done. The West Mesa bone collector understood this truth better than most, which is why his name remains unknown, his face unseen, and his victims still waiting for the justice that has eluded them for more than a decade. In a world full of famous killers and notorious criminals, sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones whose names we never learn,